Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina, Book 5, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On entering the studio, Mihailov once more scanned his visitors and noted down in his imagination Vronsky's expression too, and especially his jewels. Although his artistic sense was unceasingly at work collecting materials, although he felt a continually increasing excitement as the moment of criticizing his work drew nearer, he rapidly and subtly formed from imperceptible signs a mental image of these three persons. That fellow, Golenishtchev, was a Russian living here. Mihailov did not remember his surname, nor where he had met him, nor what he had said to him. He only remembered his face, as he remembered all the faces he had ever seen. But he remembered too that it was one of the faces laid by in his memory in the immense class of the falsely consequential and poor in expression. The abundant hair and very open forehead gave an appearance of consequence to the face, which had only one expression, a petty, childish, peevish expression, concentrated just above the bridge of the narrow nose. Vronsky and Madame Karenina must be, Mihailov supposed, distinguished and wealthy Russians, knowing nothing about art, like all those wealthy Russians, but posing as amateurs and connoisseurs. Most likely they've already looked at all the antiques, and now they're making the round of the studios of the new people, the German humbug and the cracked pre-Raphaelite English fellow, and have only come to me to make the point of view complete, he thought. He was well acquainted with the way dilettanti have. The cleverer they were, the worse he found them. Of looking at the works of contemporary artists with the sole object of being in a position to say that art is a thing of the past, and that the more one sees of the new men, the more one sees how inimitable the works of the great old masters have remained. He expected all this. He saw it all in their faces. He saw it in the careless indifference with which they talked among themselves, stared at the lay figures and busts, and walked about in leisurely fashion, waiting for him to uncover his picture. But in spite of this, while he was turning over his studies, pulling up the blinds and taking off the sheet, he was in intense excitement, especially as, in spite of his conviction that all distinguished and wealthy Russians were certain to be beasts and fools, he liked Vronsky, and still more Anna. "Here, if you please," he said, moving on one side with his nimble gait and pointing to his picture. "It's the exhortation to Pilate, Matthew, chapter 27, he said, feeling his lips were beginning to tremble with emotion. He moved away and stood behind them. For the few seconds during which the visitors were gazing at the picture in silence, Mihailov too gazed at it with the indifferent eye of an outsider. For those few seconds he was sure in anticipation that a higher, juster criticism would be uttered by them, by those very visitors whom he had been so despising a moment before. He forgot all he had thought about his picture before during the 3 years he had been painting it. He forgot all its qualities, which had been absolutely certain to him. He saw the picture with their indifferent, new, outside eyes, and saw nothing good in it. He saw in the foreground Pilate's irritated face and the serene face of Christ, and in the background the figures of Pilate's retinue and the face of John watching what was happening. Every face that, with such agony, such blunders and corrections, had grown up within him with its special character, every face that had given him such torments and such raptures, and all these faces so many times transposed for the sake of the harmony of the whole, all the shades of color and tones that he had attained with such labor, all of this together seemed to him now, looking at it with their eyes, the merest vulgarity, something that had been done 1,000 times over. The face dearest to him, the face of Christ, the center of the picture, which had given him such ecstasy as it unfolded itself to him, was utterly lost to him when he glanced at the picture with their eyes. He saw a well-painted, no, not even that, he distinctly saw now a mass of defects, repetition of those endless Christs of Titian, Raphael, Rubens, and the same soldiers and Pilate. It was all common, poor and stale, and positively badly painted, weak and unequal. They would be justified in repeating hypocritically civil speeches in the presence of the painter, and pitying him and laughing at him when they were alone again. The silence, though it lasted no more than a minute, became too intolerable to him. To break it, and to show he was not agitated, he made an effort and addressed Golenishtchev. "I think I've had the pleasure of meeting you," he said, looking uneasily first at Anna, then at Vronsky, in fear of losing any shade of their expression. "To be sure, we met at Ross's, do you remember, at that soiree, when that Italian lady recited, 'The New Rachel'?" Golenishtchev answered easily, removing his eyes without the slightest regret from the picture, and turning to the artist. Noticing, however, that Mihailov was expecting a criticism of the picture, he said, "Your picture has got on a great deal since I saw it last time. And what strikes me particularly now, as it did then, is the figure of Pilate. One so knows the man, a good-natured, capital fellow, but an official through and through, who does not know what it is he's doing. But I fancy...." All Mihailov's mobile face beamed at once. His eyes sparkled. He tried to say something, but he could not speak for excitement, and pretended to be coughing. Low as was his opinion of Golenishtchev's capacity for understanding art, trifling as was the true remark upon the fidelity of the expression of Pilate as an official, and offensive as might have seemed the utterance of so unimportant an observation, while nothing was said of more serious points, Mihailov was in an ecstasy of delight at this observation. He had himself thought about Pilate's figure just what Golenishtchev said. The fact that this reflection was but one of millions of reflections, which as Mihailov knew for certain would be true, did not diminish for him the significance of Golenishtchev's remark. His heart warmed to Golenishtchev for this remark, and from a state of depression he suddenly passed to ecstasy. At once the whole of his picture lived before him in all the indescribable complexity of everything living. Mihailov again tried to say that that was how he understood Pilate, but his lips quivered intractably, and he could not pronounce the words. Vronsky and Anna too said something in that subdued voice in which, partly to avoid hurting the artist's feelings, and partly to avoid saying out loud something silly, so easily said when talking of art, people usually speak at exhibitions of pictures. Mihailov fancied that the picture had made an impression on them too. He went up to them. "How marvelous Christ's expression is!" said Anna. Of all she saw, she liked that expression most of all, and she felt that it was the center of the picture, and so praise of it would be pleasant to the artist. "One can see that he is pitying Pilate." This again was one of the million true reflections that could be found in his picture and in the figure of Christ. She said that he was pitying Pilate. In Christ's expression there ought to be indeed an expression of pity, since there is an expression of love, of heavenly peace, of readiness for death, and a sense of the vanity of words. Of course, there is the expression of an official in Pilate and of pity in Christ, seeing that one is the incarnation of the fleshly and the other of the spiritual life. All this and much more flashed into Mihailov's thoughts. "Yes, and how that figure is done! What atmosphere! One can walk around it," said Golenishtchev, unmistakably betraying by this remark that he did not approve of the meaning and idea of the figure. "Yes, there's a wonderful mastery," said Vronsky. "How those figures in the background stand out! There you have technique," he said, addressing Golenishtchev, alluding to a conversation between them about Vronsky's despair of attaining this technique. "Yes, yes, marvelous," Golenishtchev and Anna assented. In spite of the excited condition in which he was, the sentence about technique had sent a pang to Mihailov's heart, and looking angrily at Vronsky, he suddenly scowled. He had often heard this word technique, and was utterly unable to understand what was understood by it. He knew that by this term was understood a mechanical facility for painting or drawing, entirely apart from its subject. He had noticed often that even in actual praise technique was opposed to essential quality, as though one could paint well something that was bad. He knew that a great deal of attention and care was necessary in taking off the coverings to avoid injuring the creation itself, and to take off all the coverings. But there was no art of painting, no technique of any sort about it. If to a little child or to his cook were revealed what he saw, it or she would have been able to peel the wrappings off what was seen. And the most experienced and adroit painter could not by mere mechanical facility paint anything if the lines of the subject were not revealed to him first. Besides, he saw that if it came to talking about technique, it was impossible to praise him for it. In all he had painted and repainted, he saw faults that hurt his eyes, coming from want of care in taking off the wrappings. Fault he could not correct now without spoiling the whole. And in almost all the figures and faces he saw, too, remnants of the wrappings not perfectly removed that spoiled the picture. "One thing might be said, if you will allow me to make the remark," observed Golenishtchev. "Oh, I shall be delighted, I beg you," said Mihailov with a forced smile. "That is, that you make him the man-god, and not the god-man. But I know that was what you meant to do." "I cannot paint a Christ that is not in my heart," said Mihailov gloomily. "Yes, but in that case, if you will allow me to say what I think, your picture is so fine that my observation cannot detract from it. And, besides, it is only my personal opinion. With you it is different. Your very motive is different. But let us take Ivanov. I imagine that if Christ is brought down to the level of an historical character, it would have been better for Ivanov to select some other historical subject, fresh, untouched. But if this is the greatest subject presented to art? If one looked, one would find others. But the point is that art cannot suffer doubt and discussion, and before the pictures of Ivanov, the question arises for the believer and the unbeliever alike: is it God or is it not God? And the unity of the impression is destroyed. Why so? I think that for educated people, said Mihailov, the question cannot exist. Golenishtchev did not agree with this, and confounded Mihailov by his support of his first idea of the unity of the impression being essential to art. Mihailov was greatly perturbed, but he could say nothing in defense of his own idea. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina, Book 5, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anna and Vronsky had long been exchanging glances, regretting their friend's flow of cleverness. At last Vronsky, without waiting for the artist, walked away to another small picture. "Oh, how exquisite! What a lovely thing! A gem! How exquisite!" they cried with one voice. "What is it they're so pleased with?" thought Mihailov. He had positively forgotten that picture he had painted 3 years ago. He had forgotten all the agonies and the ecstasies he had lived through with that picture, when for several months it had been the one thought haunting him day and night. He had forgotten, as he always forgot, the pictures he had finished. He did not even like to look at it, and had only brought it out because he was expecting an Englishman who wanted to buy it. "Oh, that's only an old study," he said. "How fine!" said Golenishtchev. He too, with unmistakable sincerity, falling under the spell of the picture. Two boys were angling in the shade of a willow tree. The elder had just dropped in the hook, and was carefully pulling the float from behind a bush, entirely absorbed in what he was doing. The other, a little younger, was lying in the grass leaning on his elbows, with his tangled flaxen head in his hands, staring at the water with his dreamy blue eyes. What was he thinking of? The enthusiasm over this picture stirred some of the old feeling for it in Mihailov, but he feared and disliked this waste of feeling for things past, and so, even though this praise was grateful to him, he tried to draw his visitors away to a third picture. But Vronsky asked whether the picture was for sale. To Mihailov at that moment, excited by visitors, it was extremely distasteful to speak of money matters. "It is put up there to be sold," he answered, scowling gloomily. When the visitors had gone, Mihailov sat down opposite the picture of Pilate and Christ, and in his mind went over what had been said, and what, though not said, had been implied by those visitors. And, strange to say, what had had such weight with him while they were there, and while he mentally put himself at their point of view, suddenly lost all importance for him. He began to look at his picture with all his own full artist vision, and was soon in that mood of conviction of the perfectibility and so of the significance of his picture, a conviction essential to the most intense fervor, excluding all other interests in which alone he could work. Christ's foreshortened leg was not right, though. He took his palette and began to work. As he corrected the leg, he looked continually at the figure of John in the background, which his visitors had not even noticed, but which he knew was beyond perfection. When he had finished the leg, he wanted to touch that figure, but he felt too much excited for it. He was equally unable to work when he was cold, and when he was too much affected and saw everything too much. There was only one stage in the transition from coldness to inspiration at which work was possible. Today he was too much agitated. He would have covered the picture, but he stopped, holding the cloth in his hand, and smiling blissfully, gazed a long while at the figure of John. At last, as it were regretfully tearing himself away, he dropped the cloth, and, exhausted but happy, went home. Vronsky, Anna, and Golenishtchev, on their way home, were particularly lively and cheerful. They talked of Mihailov and his pictures. The word talent, by which they meant an inborn, almost physical aptitude apart from brain and heart, and in which they tried to find an expression for all the artist had gained from life, recurred particularly often in their talk, as though it were necessary for them to sum up what they had no conception of, though they wanted to talk of it. They said that there was no denying his talent, but that his talent could not develop for want of education, the common defect of our Russian artists. But the picture of the boys had imprinted itself on their memories, and they were continually coming back to it. What an exquisite thing! How he has succeeded in it, and how simply! He doesn't even comprehend how good it is. Yes, I mustn't let it slip. I must buy it, said Vronsky. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina, Book 5, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mihailov sold Vronsky his picture and agreed to paint a portrait of Anna. On the day fixed he came and began the work. From the fifth sitting the portrait impressed everyone, especially Vronsky, not only by its resemblance, but by its characteristic beauty. It was strange how Mihailov could have discovered just her characteristic beauty. One needs to know and love her, as I have loved her, to discover the very sweetest expression of her soul, Vronsky thought, though it was only from this portrait that he had himself learned this sweetest expression of her soul. But the expression was so true that he, and others too, fancied they had long known it. I have been struggling on forever, so long without doing anything, he said of his own portrait of her, and he just looked and painted it. That's where technique comes in. That will come, was the consoling reassurance given him by Golenishtchev, in whose view Vronsky had both talent and, what was most important, culture, giving him a wider outlook on art. Golenishtchev's faith in Vronsky's talent was propped up by his own need of Vronsky's sympathy and approval for his own articles and ideas, and he felt that the praise and support must be mutual. In another man's house, and especially in Vronsky's palazzo, Mihailov was quite a different man from what he was in his studio. he behaved with hostile courtesy, as though he were afraid of coming closer to people he did not respect. He called Vronsky "Your Excellency," and, notwithstanding Anna's and Vronsky's invitations, he would never stay to dinner, nor come except for the sittings. Anna was even more friendly to him than to other people, and was very grateful for her portrait. Vronsky was more than cordial with him, and was obviously interested to know the artist's opinion of his picture. Golenishtchev never let slip an opportunity of instilling sound ideas about art into Mihailov. But Mihailov remained equally chilly to all of them. Anna was aware, from his eyes, that he liked looking at her, but he avoided conversation with her. Vronsky's talk about his painting he met with stubborn silence, and he was as stubbornly silent when he was shown Vronsky's picture. He was unmistakably bored by Golenishtchev's conversation, and he did not attempt to oppose him. Altogether Mihailov, with his reserved and disagreeable, as it were, hostile attitude, was quite disliked by them as they got to know him better, and they were glad when the sittings were over, and they were left with a magnificent portrait in their possession, and he gave up coming. Golenishtchev was the first to give expression to an idea that had occurred to all of them, which was that Mihailov was simply jealous of Vronsky. Not envious, let us say, since he has talent, but it annoys him that a wealthy man of the highest society, and a count too, you know they all detest a title, can without any particular trouble do as well, if not better, than he who has devoted all his life to it. And more than all, it's a question of culture, which he is without. Vronsky defended Mihailov, but at the bottom of his heart he believed it, because in his view a man of a different, lower world would be sure to be envious. Anna's portrait, the same subject painted from nature both by him and by Mihailov, ought to have shown Vronsky the difference between him and Mihailov, but he did not see it. Only after Mihailov's portrait was painted he left off painting his portrait of Anna, deciding that it was now not needed. His picture of medieval life he went on with, and he himself, and Golenishtchev, and still more Anna, thought it very good, because it was far more like the celebrated pictures they knew than Mihailov's picture. Mihailov, meanwhile, although Anna's portrait greatly fascinated him, was even more glad than they were when the sittings were over, and he had no longer to listen to Golenishtchev's disquisitions upon art, and could forget about Vronsky's painting. He knew that Vronsky could not be prevented from amusing himself with painting. He knew that he and all dilettanti had a perfect right to paint what they liked, but it was distasteful to him. A man could not be prevented from making himself a big wax doll and kissing it. But if the man were to come with the doll and sit before a man in love, and begin caressing his doll as the lover caressed the woman he loved, it would be distasteful to the lover. Just such a distasteful sensation was what Mihailov felt at the sight of Vronsky's painting. He felt it both ludicrous and irritating, both pitiable and offensive. Vronsky's interest in painting and the Middle Ages did not last long. He had enough taste for painting to be unable to finish his picture. The picture came to a standstill. He was vaguely aware that its defects, inconspicuous at first, would be glaring if he were to go on with it. The same experience befell him as Golenishtchev, who felt that he had nothing to say, and continually deceived himself with the theory that his idea was not yet mature, that he was working it out and collecting materials. This exasperated and tortured Golenishtchev, but Vronsky was incapable of deceiving and torturing himself, and even more incapable of exasperation. With his characteristic decision, without explanation or apology, he simply ceased working at painting. But without this occupation, the life of Vronsky and of Anna, who wondered at his loss of interest in it, struck them as intolerably tedious in an Italian town. The palazzo suddenly seemed so obtrusively old and dirty, the spots on the curtains, the cracks in the floors, the broken plaster on the cornices became so disagreeably obvious, and the everlasting sameness of Golenishtchev, and the Italian professor and the German traveler became so wearisome that they had to make some change. They resolved to go to Russia, to the country. In Petersburg, Vronsky intended to arrange a partition of the land with his brother, while Anna meant to see her son. The summer they intended to spend on Vronsky's great family estate. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina, Book 5, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Levin had been married 3 months. He was happy, but not at all in the way he had expected to be. At every step he found his former dreams disappointed, and new, unexpected surprises of happiness. He was happy, but on entering upon family life he saw at every step that it was utterly different from what he had imagined. At every step he experienced what a man would experience who, after admiring the smooth, happy course of a little boat on a lake, should get himself into that little boat. He saw that it was not all sitting still, floating smoothly, that one had to think too, not for an instant to forget where one was floating, and that there was water under one, and that one must row, and that his unaccustomed hands would be sore, and that it was only to look at it that it was easy, but that doing it, though very delightful, was very difficult. As a bachelor, when he had watched other people's married life, seen the petty cares, the squabbles, the jealousy, he had only smiled contemptuously in his heart. In his future married life there could be, he was convinced, nothing of that sort. Even the external forms, indeed, he fancied, must be utterly unlike the life of others in everything. And all of a sudden, instead of his life with his wife being made on an individual pattern, it was, on the contrary, entirely made up of the pettiest details, which he had so despised before, but which now, by no will of his own, had gained an extraordinary importance that it was useless to contend against. And Levin saw that the organization of all these details was by no means so easy as he had fancied before. Although Levin believed himself to have the most exact conceptions of domestic life, unconsciously, like all men, he pictured domestic life as the happiest enjoyment of love, with nothing to hinder and no petty cares to distract. He ought, as he conceived the position, to do his work and to find repose from it in the happiness of love. She ought to be beloved and nothing more. But like all men, he forgot that she too would want work, and he was surprised that she, his poetic, exquisite Kitty, could, not merely in the first weeks, but even in the first days of their married life, think, remember, and busy herself about tablecloths and furniture, about mattresses for visitors, about a tray, about the cook and the dinner, and so on. While they were still engaged, he had been struck by the definiteness with which she had declined the tour abroad and decided to go into the country, as though she knew of something she wanted and could still think of something outside her love. This had jarred upon him then, and now her trivial cares and anxieties jarred upon him several times. But he saw that this was essential for her, and loving her as he did, though he did not understand the reason of them, and jeered at these domestic pursuits, he could not help admiring them. He jeered at the way in which she arranged the furniture they had brought from Moscow, rearranged their room, hung up curtains, prepared rooms for visitors, a room for Dolly, saw after an abode for her new maid, ordered dinner of the old cook, came into collision with Agafea Mihalovna, taking from her the charge of the stores. He saw how the old cook smiled, admiring her and listening to her inexperienced, impossible orders. How mournfully and tenderly Agafea Mihalovna shook her head over the young mistress's new arrangements. He saw that Kitty was extraordinarily sweet when, laughing and crying, she came to tell him that her maid, Masha, was used to looking upon her as her young lady, and so no one obeyed her. It seemed to him sweet but strange, and he thought it would have been better without this. He did not know how great a sense of change she was experiencing. She, who at home had sometimes wanted some favorite dish or sweets without the possibility of getting either, now could order what she liked, buy pounds of sweets, spend as much money as she liked, and order any puddings she pleased. She was dreaming with delight now of Dolly's coming to them with her children, especially because she would order for the children their favorite puddings, and Dolly would appreciate all her new housekeeping. She did not know herself why and wherefore, but the arranging of her house had an irresistible attraction for her. Instinctively feeling the approach of spring, and knowing that there would be days of rough weather too, she built her nest as best she could, and was in haste at the same time to build it and to learn how to do it. This care for domestic details in Kitty, so opposed to Levin's ideal of exalted happiness, was at first one of the disappointments. And this sweet care of her household, the aim of which he did not understand, but could not help loving, was one of the new happy surprises. Another disappointment and happy surprise came in their quarrels. Levin could never have conceived that between him and his wife any relations could arise other than tender, respectful, and loving, and all at once, in the very early days, they quarreled, so that she said he did not care for her, that he cared for no one but himself, burst into tears and wrung her arms. This first quarrel arose from Levin's having gone out to a new farmhouse, and having been away half an hour too long, because he had tried to get home by a short cut, and had lost his way. He drove home thinking of nothing but her, of her love, of his own happiness, and the nearer he drew to home, the warmer was his tenderness for her. He ran into the room with the same feeling, with an even stronger feeling than he had had when he reached the Shtcherbatskys' house to make his offer. And suddenly he was met by a lowering expression he had never seen in her. He would have kissed her. She pushed him away. "What is it?" "You've been enjoying yourself," she began, trying to be calm and spiteful. But as soon as she opened her mouth, a stream of reproach, of senseless jealousy, of all that had been torturing her during that half hour which she had spent sitting motionless at the window, burst from her. It was only then, for the first time, that he clearly understood what he had not understood when he led her out of the church after the wedding. He felt now that he was not simply close to her, but that he did not know where he ended and she began. He felt this from the agonizing sensation of division that he experienced at that instant. He was offended for the first instant, but the very same second he felt that he could not be offended by her, that she was himself. He felt for the first moment as a man feels when, having suddenly received a violent blow from behind, he turns around, angry and eager to avenge himself, to look for his antagonist, and finds that it is he himself who has accidentally struck himself, that there is no one to be angry with, and that he must put up with and try to soothe the pain. Never afterwards did he feel it with such intensity, but this first time he could not for a long while get over it. His natural feeling urged him to defend himself, to prove to her she was wrong. But to prove her wrong would mean irritating her still more, and making the rupture greater. That was the cause of all his suffering. One habitual feeling impelled him to get rid of the blame and to pass it on to her. Another feeling, even stronger, impelled him as quickly as possible to smooth over the rupture without letting it grow greater. To remain under such undeserved reproach was wretched, but to make her suffer by justifying himself was worse still. Like a man half awake in an agony of pain, he wanted to tear out, to fling away the aching place, and coming to his senses, he felt that the aching place was himself. He could do nothing but try to help the aching place to bear it, and this he tried to do. They made peace. She, recognizing that she was wrong, though she did not say so, became tenderer to him, and they experienced new, redoubled happiness in their love. But that did not prevent such quarrels from happening again, and exceedingly often too, on the most unexpected and trivial grounds. These quarrels frequently arose from the fact that they did not yet know what was of importance to each other, and that all this early period they were both often in a bad temper. When one was in a good temper, and the other in a bad temper, the peace was not broken. But when both happened to be in an ill humor, quarrels sprang up from such incomprehensibly trifling causes that they could never remember afterwards what they had quarreled about. It is true that when they were both in a good temper, their enjoyment of life was redoubled, but still this first period of their married life was a difficult time for them. During all this early time they had a peculiarly vivid sense of tension, as it were, a tugging in opposite directions of the chain by which they were bound. Altogether their honeymoon, that is to say, the month after their wedding, from which, from tradition, Levin expected so much, was not merely not a time of sweetness, but remained in the memories of both as the bitterest and most humiliating period in their lives. They both alike tried in later life to blot out from their memories all the monstrous, shameful incidents of that morbid period, when both were rarely in a normal frame of mind, both were rarely quite themselves. It was only in the third month of their married life, after their return from Moscow, where they had been staying for a month, that their life began to go more smoothly. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina, Book 5, by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. They had just come back from Moscow and were glad to be alone. He was sitting at the writing table in his study, writing. She, wearing the dark lilac dress she had worn during the first days of their married life, and put on again today, a dress particularly remembered and loved by him, was sitting on the sofa, the same old-fashioned leather sofa which had always stood in the study in Levin's father's and grandfather's days. She was sewing at broderie anglaise. He thought and wrote, never losing the happy consciousness of her presence. His work, both on the land and on the book, in which the principles of the new land system were to be laid down, had not been abandoned, but just as, formerly, these pursuits and ideas had seemed to him petty and trivial in comparison with the darkness that overspread all life, now they seemed as unimportant and petty in comparison with the life that lay before him, suffused with the brilliant light of happiness. He went on with his work, but he felt now that the center of gravity of his attention had passed to something else, and that consequently he looked at his work quite differently and more clearly. Formerly, this work had been for him an escape from life. Formerly he had felt that without this work his life would be too gloomy. Now these pursuits were necessary for him that life might not be too uniformly bright. Taking up his manuscript, reading through what he had written, he found with pleasure that the work was worth his working at. Many of his old ideas seemed to him superfluous and extreme, but many blanks became distinct to him when he reviewed the whole thing in his memory. He was writing now a new chapter on the causes of the present disastrous condition of agriculture in Russia. He maintained that the poverty of Russia arises not merely from the anomalous distribution of landed property and misdirected reforms, but that what had contributed of late years to this result was the civilization from without abnormally grafted upon Russia, especially facilities of communication, as railways, leading to centralization in towns, the development of luxury, and the consequent development of manufactures, credit, and its accompaniment of speculation, all to the detriment of agriculture. It seemed to him that in a normal development of wealth in a state, all these phenomena would arise only when a considerable amount of labor had been put into agriculture, when it had come under regular, or at least definite, conditions, that the wealth of a country ought to increase proportionally, and especially in such a way that other sources of wealth should not outstrip agriculture, that in harmony with a certain stage of agriculture there should be means of communication corresponding to it, and that in our unsettled condition of the land, railways, called into being by political and not by economic needs, were premature, and instead of promoting agriculture, as was expected of them, they were competing with agriculture and promoting the development of manufactures and credit, and so arresting its progress. and that just as the one-sided and premature development of one organ in an animal would hinder its general development, so in the general development of wealth in Russia, credit, facilities of communication, manufacturing activity, indubitably necessary in Europe, where they had arisen in their proper time, had with us only done harm by throwing into the background the chief question calling for settlement, the question of the organization of agriculture. While he was writing his ideas, she was thinking how unnaturally cordial her husband had been to young Prince Tcharsky, who had, with great want of tact, flirted with her the day before they left Moscow. "He's jealous," she thought. "Goodness, how sweet and silly he is! He's jealous of me. If he knew that I think no more of them than of Pyotr the cook," she thought, looking at his head and red neck, with a feeling of possession strange to herself. "Though it's a pity to take him from his work, but he has plenty of time. I must look at his face. Will he feel I'm looking at him? I wish he'd turn round. I will him to." And she opened her eyes wide, as though to intensify the influence of her gaze. "Yes, they draw away all the sap and give a false appearance of prosperity," he muttered, stopping to write, and feeling that she was looking at him and smiling, he looked around. "Well?" he queried, smiling and getting up. He looked round, she thought. "It's nothing. I wanted you to look round," she said, watching him, and trying to guess whether he was vexed at being interrupted or not. "How happy we are alone together. I am, that is," he said, going up to her with a radiant smile of happiness. "I'm just as happy. I'll never go anywhere, especially not to Moscow." "And what were you thinking about?" "I was thinking... No, no, go along. Go on writing. Don't break off," she said, pursing up her lips. "And I must cut out these little holes now, do you see?" She took up her scissors and began cutting them out. "No, tell me, what was it?" he said, sitting down beside her and watching the tiny scissors moving round. "Oh, what was I thinking about? I was thinking about Moscow, about the back of your head." "Why should I, of all people, have such happiness? It's unnatural, too good," he said, kissing her hand. "I feel quite the opposite. The better things are, the more natural it seems to me." "And you've got a little curl loose," he said, carefully turning her head round. "A little curl? Oh yes. No, no, we are busy at our work." Work did not progress further, and they darted apart from one another like culprits when Kouzma came in to announce that tea was ready. "Have they come from the town?" Levin asked Kouzma. "They've just come. They're unpacking the things." "Come quickly," she said to him as she went out of the study, "or else I shall read your letters without you." Left alone, after putting his manuscripts together in the new portfolio bought by her, he washed his hands at the new washstand with the elegant fittings that had all made their appearance with her. Levin smiled at his own thoughts and shook his head disapprovingly at those thoughts. A feeling akin to remorse fretted him. There was something shameful, effeminate, Capuan, as he called it to himself, in his present mode of life. "It's not right to go on like this," he thought. "It'll soon be 3 months, and I'm doing next to nothing. Today, almost for the first time, I set to work seriously, and what happened? I did nothing but begin and throw it aside. Even my ordinary pursuits I have almost given up. On the land I scarcely walk or drive about at all to look after things. Either I am loath to leave her, or I see she's dull alone. And I used to think that, before marriage, life was nothing much, somehow didn't count, but that after marriage life began in earnest. And here, almost 3 months have passed, and I have spent my time so idly and unprofitably. No, this won't do. I must begin. Of course, it's not her fault. She's not to blame in any way. I ought myself to be firmer, to maintain my masculine independence of action, or else I shall get into such ways, and she'll get used to them too. Of course, she's not to blame, he told himself. But it is hard for anyone who is dissatisfied not to blame someone else, and especially the person nearest of all to him, for the ground of his dissatisfaction. And it vaguely came into Levin's mind that she herself was not to blame. She could not be to blame for anything. But what was to blame was her education, too superficial and frivolous. That fool Charsky, she wanted, I know, to stop him, but didn't know how to. Yes, apart from her interest in the house, that she has, apart from her dress and broderie anglaise, she has no serious interests. No interest in her work, in the estate, in the peasants, nor in music, though she's rather good at it, nor in reading. She does nothing, and is perfectly satisfied. Levin, in his heart, censured this, and did not as yet understand that she was preparing for that period of activity which was to come for her, when she would at once be the wife of her husband and mistress of the house, and would bear and nurse and bring up children. He knew not that she was instinctively aware of this, and preparing herself for this time of terrible toil, did not reproach herself for the moments of carelessness and happiness in her love that she enjoyed now, while gaily building her nest for the future. End of chapter 15.